All right, this next lecture is going to be about the heart. So we just finished the blood, which is part of the cardiovascular system. The big center of the cardiovascular system is going to be the heart, and then after this we'll cover the blood vessels, which will finish off the cardiovascular system. So in general, things about the heart: it pumps blood through the circulation. There are 4 chambers in the human heart. The upper 2 are called atria. Singular is atrium. And then the lower 2 are called ventricles. And there's a left and a right of each of these. It's hard to talk about the heart without talking about blood vessels. So the blood vessels that lead to and away from the heart are important. And the ones that carry blood away from the heart are called arteries. The ones that carry blood towards the heart are called veins. And you'll learn more about those when we do the blood vessel lecture next. And there's 2 major circulations associated with the heart. One is called systemic, the other pulmonary. So for starters, the pulmonary circulation, its job is to carry blood to the lungs so it can pick up oxygen and then bring it back to the heart. And then the systemic circulation carries blood away from the heart out to the all the tissues in the body that need oxygen and nutrients, like muscle, the brain, any organs that need blood and nutrients. And so you can think of the systemic circulation as the circulation that supplies most of the body tissues with oxygen and nutrients, whereas the pulmonary circulation, its job is to basically re-oxygenate the blood. And that, if you look at this picture, it kind of gives you an idea of those 2 circulations. So I'm going to talk you through this picture. And even though it's really, really basic, so you can see the upper 2 chambers here and here. These are our left and right atria. And then the lower 2 of these are our ventricles. And we'll start with the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart pumps to the pulmonary circulation. So the blood flow is going to look like this. The blood's going to go from the right atrium to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to head out to the lungs. And remember, the vessels that carried blood away from the heart are called arteries. So this and this, these would be pulmonary arteries because they're pulmonary circulation and they're carrying blood away from the heart. Then, as you can see, the blood is going to go through the lung tissue, and as it's going through, it's going to pick up oxygen. And that's what you're seeing. So in anatomy, blue in a blood vessel means it has little oxygen. Red means it has a lot of oxygen. So what's happening as this blood is flowing through the lungs, it's picking up oxygen. And so now these blood vessels are carrying the blood back towards the heart. These would be pulmonary veins because the veins carry blood to the heart. The pulmonary veins on either side are going to take blood back to the left atrium. From the left atrium, the blood goes to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps blood into the systemic circulation that goes all over the body. So we'll assume this down here is the lower body, this up here is the upper body. But as you can imagine, it's a lot more complex than that. So left ventricle pumps blood into the systemic circulation. So this and this would be systemic arteries because they're carrying blood away from the heart and they're in the systemic circulation. Notice as the blood passes through the tissues, this might be skeletal muscle, it changes back to blue, and that is indicating that the oxygen has been dropped off to the tissues, and now the blood is heading back to the heart, and this would be a systemic vein, and this would be a systemic vein too because it's carrying blood towards the heart. And then we're back where we started at the right atrium, and then it's just going to keep doing that. So anatomical features of the heart, there's a lot to talk about here, but if we took like a cross section through the torso, we would see that this view right here. And remember, we talked about this early in the semester, but the space that the heart sits in is called the mediastinum. It's kind of between your vertebra, your sternum, and your 2 lungs. Most of the heart kind of sits on the left side of the body, so it's not perfectly centered. And the bottom of the heart is called the base. I'm sorry, the bottom of the heart where this point is called the apex. And the top part of the heart where all these big blood vessels are called the base. So apex is always referring to a pointed region. in anatomy. So base up here, apex here. All right, and then we need to talk about what covers the heart. This can be a little bit confusing, but we'll keep it as straightforward as we can here. So I'm going to start actually down here to try to make it a little bit easier to comprehend. So if we look at the wall of the heart, so here's, for instance, your left ventricle, but you can see that the wall of the heart is made up of a certain thickness, and there's 3 layers of this, and this is what we call the heart wall. Starting inside, so where the blood would be inside the ventricle. So this little thin layer right there, that would be the endocardium. So endocardium, inner lining of the chambers of the heart. Then we have this thick layer. This is where all the cardiac muscle is. This is the myocardium. Think myo muscle. So myocardium. And then this outermost layer right here is called the epicardium. This little layer right here. And this is where the confusing part comes in. You'll see in a few minutes. So the heart wall is endocardium, myocardium, epicardium. All right, so on top of that, we have this sac that holds the heart. It's partially made up of a serous membrane, which hopefully you remember has 2 layers to it itself. So this sac that the heart sits in is called the pericardium. There's 2 parts to it. There's a fibrous pericardium and a serous pericardium. So the fibrous pericardium is all this connective tissue out here, this fibrous connective tissue. So if we look at this view, you can see it a little bit better because it's blown up. So all this is the fibrous pericardium. Underneath that, or deep to that, we have the serous pericardium, which consists of a serous membrane that has 2 layers. So we have a parietal pericardium, and we have a visceral pericardium here. And between the 2, we have a pericardial cavity. And remember from what we said earlier in the semester, this is the serous cavity that has serous fluid in it. So parietal pericardium, so parietal layer of the serous pericardium, visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and the pericardial cavity is between the 2. All right, the confusing part of this is that this visceral layer of the serous pericardium is the same thing as the epicardium that we talked about earlier. So basically this and this are the same thing. So visceral pericardium and the epicardium are the same thing. So they have 2 separate names for the same thing, just unfortunately that's just the way it is. All right, here's a close view of the heart wall. So you hear the endocardium, myocardium, epicardium. Good, and remember the epicardium is the same thing as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. All right, so a little bit about cardiac muscle. You know a lot about it already, so this is mainly a review. Cardiac muscle cells have 1 to 2 nuclei. Fibers are branched, lots of mitochondria because lots of ATP production, uses oxygen. It's striated, also has these things called intercalated discs that allows the cells to communicate rapidly. Intercalated discs, as you remember, are made up of gap junctions. All right, so let's run through the anatomy of the heart. The external anatomy of the heart is not overly complicated, but there are a few key things that we need to point out. So the upper 2 chambers, again, are atria, bottom 2 ventricles, so you can see that. I'm going to jump down here and talk about coronary sulcus. So the coronary sulcus is this groove between the atria and ventricles. So it would kind of run across the heart like this, coronary sulcus. And then there's a groove in the front between the ventricles. That would be the anterior interventricular sulcus. And in the back, we have a groove between the 2 ventricles, and that would be the posterior interventricular sulcus. So on top of that, we have 2 huge arteries that you can see from the external view of the heart. So this big red one, this is called the aorta. This is what the left ventricle pumps blood into. So when blood leaves the left ventricle and goes into the systemic circulation, it goes into this aorta. and the aorta is going to branch into a lot of different other arteries. And then the other one from the right ventricle, when blood leaves the right ventricle and goes to the pulmonary circulation, it first enters this big artery called the pulmonary trunk. So pulmonary trunk is where blood goes after it leaves the right ventricle. All right, so let's talk about the valves of the heart. There's 4 really important valves in the heart that regulate blood flow. So there's 2 between the atria and ventricles. These are called atrioventricular valves. So on the right side, we have this one right here. This is called the tricuspid valve. On the left side, we have this one right here. This would be the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve is also known as the mitral valve. And then the valves between the ventricles and the blood vessels are called semilunar valves. So the valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And the valve between the left ventricle and the aorta is called the aortic semilunar valve. And an important thing to consider here that's going to come up on the next slide is that if you took a section through the heart about like right here, it almost looks like all those valves are right in line with each other. And so that's important for the next slide because they're all kind of anchored together. And they're anchored together with fibrous connective tissue, and it's called a fibrous skeleton. So when you take that section through the heart like this, you can see how all these valves are kind of connected by this connective tissue. That's known as the fibrous skeleton. So it anchors the valves. It also serves as an electrical insulator, so it prevents electricity from just freely flowing from the atria to the ventricles, because what you're going to see is that you want electricity flowing through the heart to follow a very specific pattern, so you get a nice coordinated contraction of the heart. All right, so now we'll go chamber by chamber and point out the key features. So one of the things that you're going to be expected to do, and one of the things we normally do in lab, is pin the heart, and you're going to pin a lot of the features. So we'll do a labeling exercise where you can identify these things that we're about to point out. So we'll just go chamber by chamber and point out some of the unique things about it and some of the structures. So the right atrium receives blood from the systemic circulation, and the vessels that drain into the right atrium include the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. These don't mean a lot to you right now, but they will, especially when we talk about blood vessels. So just take it for what it is right now. These are the big vessels emptying blood into the right atrium. So there's an interatrial septum. That would just be kind of this wall right here between the 2 atria. Fossa ovalis, we're going to say is this, and even though it's not labeled. So the fossa ovalis is a little depression inside the right atrium. It's a remnant of the fetal circulation. So in the fetal circulation, there was actually an opening between the 2 atria called the foramen ovale. And before a child is born, it closes, or it should close, and what's left is just this kind of depression. So that's the fossa ovalis. So any muscles in the atria on the inside inner wall of the atria are called pectinate muscles. And then you can't really see it in this picture, but I'll go back so you can see it. The auricle is like a flap-like sac on the front of the atria. So if I go back to maybe this picture here, this kind of like fluffiness that you see on the atria, that's called the auricle. And it just allows the atria to fill up a little bit more. All right, and then blood's going to go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. That leads us to the right ventricle. So there's an interventricular septum, and that would be this, between the ventricles. All these little things that kind of look like spongy bone in the background, that's called trabeculae carnae. Just think trabeculae of bone. These muscles here that are attached to the valve, these are called papillary muscles. On the right side, there's 3 because this is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 flaps, so 3 papillary muscles. And then the chordae tendineae are these little kind of ligaments that or tendons, I should say, that attach the papillary muscles to the valve. And blood flows through the right, after blood leaves the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, goes out to the pulmonary circulation, goes to the lungs, gets reoxygenated, comes back to the left side of the heart, so it end up then in the left atrium. And the left atrium, very similar to the right, with the exception that it does not have that fossa ovalis. It has the pectinate muscles, has the auricle. And then blood's going to leave the left atrium, go through the bicuspid or mitral valve to the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is very similar to the right. It has the trabeculae carnae, two papillary muscles because it's a bicuspid valve with two flaps. Still have the chordae tendineae, still have the trabeculae carnae. One thing you should notice is the wall of the left ventricle is much thicker than that of the right. And that's an easy way to tell the right from the left in the heart. And that has to do with the left side of the heart has to pump blood all through the body. So it's under a lot more pressure and it generates more pressure. So in response to that, it adapts and gets more muscular. The right side of the heart only has to pump blood to the pulmonary circulation or the lungs, which are right next to it. So it doesn't have to work as hard. So the left side of the heart works much harder than the right. And you see that. And so the left ventricle starts to get bigger and it hypertrophies. And you can see that clearly in this picture when they do a cross section. All right, there was one other point that I wanted to point out about this, since we're talking about valves and the papillary muscles. So a lot of people kind of assume that these papillary muscles, their job is to contract and open up the valves, but that's not really what they're doing. So due to pressure, these valves are going to open by themselves. So what the papillary muscles' job is so if you can envision these ventricles contracting, when they contract, we want blood to go out into the circulation. And so the pressure building up in the ventricles is going to automatically shut these valves. But if we didn't have these papillary muscles, they might invert. And it's possible that we would get blood flowing back into the atria. So to prevent that, these papillary muscles are going to basically hold on and hold these valves shut and prevent them from allowing backflow into the atria. All right, so that's pretty much it for the anatomy of the heart. So a few more just physiological things we need to talk about. The cardiac cycle, relatively simple. So the heart contracts and then it relaxes. And the contraction phase is called systole. The relaxation phase is called diastole. So systole, contraction, diastole, relaxation. And another kind of interesting fact about the heart is the heart fills up primarily during, it fills up during diastole, I should say. But I'll try to talk through a picture of this to make a little sense. So if you can envision blood flowing back to the heart from the various circulations, so the heart's filling up while it's relaxing, blood's going to flow into the atria, and a lot of it's going to pass right through and start filling up the ventricles. But then what you're going to get is the atria contract first, and then the ventricles. So when the ventricles, just by blood flowing back to the heart, the ventricles are going to fill up about 70% of their capacity. And then the atria contract and contribute another approximate 30%. So key point that most of the heart does fill up during diastole. The ventricles fill up about 70%, and then when the atria contract, it basically tops off the ventricles, and then a split second later, the ventricles contract and eject blood out into the circulations. You'll see why that happens when we talk about the electrical flow through the heart. So that's what I was trying to put into words here. So during diastole, a lot of blood flows through the atria and begins to fill the ventricles. Then the atria contract and top off the ventricles. And then the ventricles contract, pumping blood through the circulations. All right, so the electrical flow through the heart, we call it the cardiac conduction system, and gives the heart the ability to generate its own rhythm. So we call it autorhythmicity. There's 5 components to the cardiac conduction system, the sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, bundle of His, bundle branches, and Purkinje fibers. And they're in that order for a reason. So if I show you this picture, here's the sinoatrial node, AV node. This is called the bundle of His. These are your two bundle branches. Then everything else going through the ventricles is called the Purkinje fibers. So it works kind of like this. The SA node or sinoatrial node serves as the pacemaker in a healthy heart. It's going to generate an action potential a number of times per minute. So we could say at rest it's doing it maybe 60 times per minute. And that electricity flows across the atria, so right all the way across the left atrium, and that's going to stimulate the atria to contract. And then that depolarization action potential is eventually going to reach the AV node and then travel down the bundle of His, through the bundle branches, and then out to the Purkinje fibers. And as that's happening, the ventricles contract. So this is why you get the atria contracting before the ventricles. It has to do with the order of depolarization of this conduction system. So SA node, AV node, bundle of His, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. And that gives the heart a nice coordinated contraction where the atria contract first, followed by the ventricles a split second later. And remember, the benefit of that is the atria are topping off the ventricles, allowing maximal filling before they contract. And so here's just some pictures kind of showing the flow of electricity through the heart. The other thing I want to point out about this is we can measure this activity, this electrical activity. It's called an electrocardiogram or EKG. Some people call it ECG. But it's just a record of electrical flow through the heart. And if you look at an EKG, and we'll do this one first, all of this from the P wave to the T wave, that's one cardiac cycle. And each wave signifies something going on in the heart. So what we see here, the P wave represents atrial depolarization. Then we get this QRS complex. That's ventricular depolarization. And then we get a T wave, and that's repolarization of the ventricles. And so we have atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and ventricular repolarization. So you may be wondering where atrial repolarization is. Generally speaking, it's so minimal, it doesn't really make a waveform on the EKG. And the other thing that some people say, maybe it's just hidden under the QRS complex. So either way, it's would not be, atrial repolarization does not give a waveform big enough to really be recognized. So one thing I wanted to bring up here on this tracing up here, so we're seeing 5 heartbeats here. And if there's 1 second between these complexes, that means that that's a heart rate of about 60 beats per minute. So 1 beat every second. And so if the heart rate sped up, you can imagine these waveforms would be a lot closer together. All right. One of the last few things I want to bring up, coronary circulation. So cardiac muscle obviously needs its own blood supply. So we have the system of blood vessels that supplies the cardiac muscle with oxygen and nutrients. It's called the coronary circulation. And so the coronary arteries, there's a left and a right coming off the aorta. And the right one branches into 2 branches called the marginal and then posterior interventricular, which goes around back. So marginal, and then around the back you have posterior interventricular. And the left coronary artery branches into this one that stays in the front. This is called the left anterior descending. You can also call it the anterior interventricular. Most commonly it's known as the LAD, left anterior descending. And then one that kind of wraps around the left lateral side of the heart, this is the circumflex. So those are our main coronary arteries. And just like we have coronary arteries, we have coronary veins. There's 3 big ones. So, and then a fourth I'm going to add. So in the front, we have a great cardiac vein draining the heart. On the kind of the right side, we have small cardiac vein, and in the back, we have the middle cardiac vein. All 3 of those drain into this big vein. It's not actually called a vein; it's called a sinus. But the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is in the back of the heart, and it kind of collects all the deoxygenated blood from these 3 coronary veins. And the coronary sinus is going to dump blood into the right atrium. That's one of the vessels dumping blood into the right atrium so it can go eventually back to the lungs and get reoxygenated. And then lastly, autonomic innervation, the sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart, parasympathetic nervous system slows down the heart. So when you're stressed out and your sympathetic nervous system is active, heart is gonna beat faster and contract more forcefully. When you're resting and your parasympathetic nervous system is active, the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, if you remember, is going to basically cause the heart to contract less forcefully and basically slow down. So if you think about your resting heart rate, you might have a resting heart rate in the 50s or 60s, which is relatively slow. That's because your parasympathetic nervous system is slowing it down. But then if you transition to maybe exercising, when your sympathetic nervous system is active, your heart rate will go well over 150 and maybe approach 200 beats per minute, depending on how intense you're exercising.